only did the Film Fest group, not only did the Film Fest group just talk about Wolf Hall, which really features Anne's story, but also this is actually the 500th anniversary of Anne's entry into the English court. And that's where it all kicked off. That's where she met Henry. So to give you the very 2-second brief overview, just in case any of you don't know who she is, she was the second wife of the Tudor king, Henry VIII. Henry was notorious for collecting wives. He had 6 of them in total. And he married Anne after annulling his marriage to his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, to whom he was married for over 20 years. But Henry, there's lots of motives that Henry may have had for marrying Anne, but certainly one of the motives was he wanted a male heir. He desperately needed a male heir. That's something Catherine could not give him. So that was one of the reasons. But of course, it launched this huge catastrophic incident where, oh, I shouldn't say catastrophic, but I mean, it was a huge incident where the English Reformation came about as part of this, because Henry broke with the Church of Rome, with the Roman Catholic Church, because they wouldn't allow him to divorce his wife. Now, ultimately, Anne did not give Henry the son he wanted, and 3 years later, she was executed on grounds of adultery and high treason, and even incest. So we'll talk about that later. I named this myth and reality because I was trying to think about how to approach this talk. And the thing with Anne is, after she died, Henry VIII pretty much erased every trace of her that he could. So there's very little that exists in Anne's own words. We have several love letters from Henry to Anne that are in the Vatican library now, but we only have 1 or 2 letters from Anne to Henry, and one of those is probably not even legit. They think now that that's probably not legit. And then a few other letters that she wrote over her life, a couple of scribbles and a prayer book, but we've got very little about her firsthand. We do have reports, secondhand reports or reports of her from ambassadors that were at the English court, other people writing, but often these had their own political biases, you know, their own agendas that they were telling the story. So we don't have a lot about her. And because of this, a lot of myths did grow up about Anne Boleyn. And to this day, historians debate everything from the date of her birth to what she looked like, to whether she was innocent or not of the charges against her. So that's kind of all the things I'm going to try to squeeze in here today. So, oops, let me go down here. So when we talk about Anne, so who was she? What's myth? What's reality? For supporters of Catherine of Aragon, Henry VIII's first wife, she was a schemer. She was an immoral whore. Whore was used often when describing her. Some people thought she was a witch. And this kind of carried on even in her daughter's reign much later, decades later, where they were trying to discredit her daughter. So they would say these things as well, particularly Catholics, because there was that split with the Catholic Church. For Elizabethan Lutherans, on the other hand, during her daughter's reign, and she was a heroine of the Protestant Reformation. Still later, she was seen, as you can see it on this painting on the side, this Victorian era painting, she was seen as a sacrificial victim of a tyrannical king. Here are some quotes on the left that you can see that were said about her: common stewed whore, the concubine. This one, the concubine and the great whore, this comes from the ambassador to the Holy Roman Emperor, Charles V. He did have his particular political agenda and bias because Charles V was the nephew of Henry's first wife, Catherine of Aragon. So we get a lot of our information from this guy, Eustace Chapuis, but we also have to consider what his take on everything was, considering that, you know, he was working for Catherine of Aragon's nephew. And then Cardinal Wolsey, who we'll talk about later, who she also butted heads with, referred to her as the Night Crow. So lots of rumors about her, and some you know, some not so nice things said about her. So the other thing I was going to say was, you know, there have been tons of TV shows and movies and books that write about her. And again, she's either described as a spirited rebel or as a feminist or as a cold manipulator, depending on whose take you look at. So I'm going to attempt to address both what we know and what we don't know about Anne and her place in history. And to start that, I want to just briefly talk a little bit about the Tudors. So the Tudors are probably one of the best known dynasties in English history, if you know anything about English history. And again, in part because their story lives on through all of these books and movies and television series. But they lasted less than 120 years. It was a short reign, a short monarchy. There were only 6 monarchs in total, and actually one of them was never crowned. She was only queen for 9 days. So very short reign, but 2 of them that if you know anything about English history, people know. I mean, these have name recognition. So on the left is Henry VIII, and on the right is Elizabeth I. She reigned, I'm thinking about Queen Elizabeth II dying today. Elizabeth I reigned for over 45 years. So again, for many people, she was the monarch of their era. And of course, they're both connected very closely with Anne because Henry was married to Anne and Elizabeth was Anne's only child.
Living child.
Living child, yes, of course, living child. So as I said, lots of TV shows, lots of books, lots of films, it goes on. And the reason that the Tudors have held this fascination on for so long, it's very simple. There's 3 elements that sell every single time, including Anne's story, and it's drama, it's sex, and it's scandal. And this story has all 3. All right, so to talk a little bit about what we do know about Anne, she was the daughter of Thomas Boleyn. He was an English nobleman and a diplomat at Henry's court. So he and his wife Elizabeth, she was their daughter. We don't know her exact birth date. There's some debate about that. There are 2 theories. One is she was born in 1501. The other was they say she was born in 1507. So we're really not sure. And the reason for the lack of clarity is because they weren't keeping, you weren't required to keep parish registers at that time. This didn't happen until 1558 that you had to keep parish registers. And she was a girl, she was, so the females weren't always registered anyway, as dutifully as boys were. We do know that Anne had 2 siblings, at least 2 siblings, a probable older sister and a probable younger brother. Again, we don't have their exact dates, but we know she had a sister and a brother. She may have also had 2 other brothers that died in infancy, but that's really up for debate. There's kind of sketchy information on that. Now, Thomas Boleyn was very, very ambitious for his children's futures. And so Anne and her siblings were very well educated. George, her brother, he followed his father's footsteps and became a diplomat at Henry's court. And later, Anne and her sister Mary would serve both at the English court, French court first, and then the English court. This is Hever Castle. This is where Anne spent some of her early years. It's also where she kind of retreated to when Henry started wooing her for some time. So Hever, of course, is very identified with Anne, being Anne's childhood home, and it's open for tours and things like that. So in 1513, Anne was sent as a maid of honor to the Burgundian court of Margaret of Austria. And this is a picture of the court. And it was here that Anne really became fluent in French, and she started learning the ways, the kind of skills necessary to be a refined young woman at that time. And her father set up this posting for her because he used to be a diplomat at this court. Now, around 1515, Anne and her sister Mary both made their way to the French court. And Anne ended up staying for several years. She stayed until 1521. She came back to England in 1521. Supposedly, we're told to take part in an arranged marriage with a cousin, an Irish cousin. But then all talk about that, any records of that disappeared. She never got married. We're not quite sure what happened with that. There's speculation about that. But the following year in 1522, she did end up in the court of Henry VIII as a lady in waiting to his wife, Catherine of Aragon. Now, I do have to talk a little bit about Henry and Catherine. Henry was never meant to be king. Henry was he had an older brother, Arthur. So Henry was never supposed to be king. Arthur, when he was very young, was betrothed to Catherine, to Princess Catherine of Aragon. She was the daughter of Isabel and Ferdinand of Spain. And they married as young teenagers, but they were only married for about 6 months when Arthur died unexpectedly. So shortly after that, the 16-year-old Princess Catherine was betrothed to Arthur's younger brother, Henry, but they didn't actually get married until Henry took the throne, until after his own father died. So they didn't get married until 1509. Now, when we think of Henry, we think of this kind of picture, right? The big heavy set guy, the sort of glutton. But actually, Henry in his youth was said to be the perfect image of a king. He was athletic. He was handsome. They said he had a 32-inch waist when they looked at his armor. Very well built. And when Catherine, and this is a young Catherine on the left, when Catherine and Henry wed, it was said to be a love match. It was actually a love match, even though these marriages were always dynastic and always, to make agreements between different countries. But they were said to actually be in love with each other, and they lived happily together for many, many years, quite some time to come. But between 1510 and 1518, Catherine gave birth to 6 children, including 2 sons. But all of them, except their daughter Mary, were either stillborn or died in early infancy. And over the years, Henry's eyes kind of wandered. He took several mistresses, including Anne Boleyn's sister, and at least one mistress who did bear him a son, but he didn't have any legitimate male heirs. And this presented a real problem for Henry. And I'm not going to get into the War of the Roses, because that would be a 3-hour presentation in and of itself. But suffice to say, Henry's father, the first Tudor king, Henry VII, came to the throne because he defeated Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth. And when the first Henry came to the throne, Henry VII, first Henry, Tudor Henry, his claim to the throne was pretty sketchy. It came both from the maternal and paternal lines, but both of those came through illegitimate lines. So there were a lot of people out there who wanted to get rid of these Tudors and thought they were upstarts and thought they shouldn't be there. So when Henry VIII became king, of course, it was very important for him to try to solidify the dynasty. And to do that, he needed male heirs. He needed to have at least one living male heir. So if we go to 1525, Anne Boleyn is at court. She's somewhere between the ages of 19 and 25, depending on when she was born. Queen Catherine was almost 41 years old. She had lost her youthful looks, although I don't think she looks so bad here, but she was no longer that young, beautiful woman. And she hadn't been pregnant in almost 10 years. So we know that at some point in the mid-1520s, Henry's attention turned to Anne. And the question is, what attracted him to her? What did he find appealing about her? In part, again, she seemed somewhat exotic, because she came from the court. She brought these French manners. She had spent several years in France. She even talked with a slight French accent. So she was very alluring in that sense, very sophisticated, very intelligent, very witty, a little different than some of the women at the English court. So first myth, did Anne have 6 fingers? So to talk about the contemporary descriptions of Anne, again, all of these come from ambassadors who were at the English court. And she was described overall as being of middling height, which would be about 5'3", 5'4" back then, an oval face. She had a swarthy complexion, a darker complexion. And she had brunette hair. Well, because at that time in England, the standard of beauty was, porcelain skin, very pale, blonde hair or light red hair. So Anne looked a little different. The Venetian ambassador said she wasn't the handsomest woman, but the French ambassador, someone from the French court said, oh, but she was beautiful. She had an elegant figure, so graceful, you would never know she was an English woman. You would have thought she was French born. That could have been French snobbery. We don't know. But contemporaries were all united in the fact that she had these amazingly beautiful dark eyes, and they were very captivating, and she used them to her advantage. Now, this six finger thing, where does this come from? Well, one largely unflattering description of Anne comes from Nicholas Sanders. He was a Catholic writer in her daughter Elizabeth's reign. So Nicholas Sanders was only 6 years old when Anne died. He never saw Anne. He never saw Anne, but he wanted to discredit her daughter. And in order to do that, he was, casting dispersions on Anne's looks and trying to actually equate her with being a witch, although he didn't, I don't think he came right out and said that. But he said she had black hair. That's the only description we ever had of Anne having black hair, and that's often associated, or was back then, with witches. She had a complexion that looked like she had jaundice. She had a projecting tooth under her upper lip, and on her right hand, she had 6 fingers. She also had a large growth under her neck that she tried to hide with high collars. Now, at the same time, even though he's saying all of this about her, he does concede she was handsome to look at and she had a pretty mouth. So, but the point is, this physical description, these kind of descriptions of Anne, these kept being written in biographies of Anne right up into the 1970s, that she had 6 fingers, that she had this large growth. And it's hard for me and others to believe that Henry, who could have had any woman in the world, would have been attracted to somebody with this many kind of physical quirks or deformities. So, but the legend lived on for a very long time. Now, as I said, Henry tried to destroy everything about Anne after her death. So most of the original portraits of Anne were destroyed after her execution. The paintings we see of Anne now, most of those were done during her daughter Elizabeth's reign. So much, much later, the ones that are still around. The artist Hans Holbein, who was a court painter in Henry's court, and who actually Anne championed, she was a great champion of the arts when she was queen. There are 2 sketches here that are Holbein's sketches, both said to be Anne Boleyn, but the labeling, you can see up here, Anne Boleyn Queen, the labels, the writing on those were put on much, much later. These were not Holbein's words. And if you look at the 2 of these, they don't even look like the same person. The nose looks different. It's very hard to think that a queen would be sketched dressed like this in very modest clothing. I've always hoped that this was always my idea of Anne, and for a very long time, this is one of the portraits that was identified as Anne. But again, we just don't know. The only undisputed portrait that we have of Anne is on the left here, unfortunately badly damaged. It's a 1.5-inch lead little disc, and it was made as a prototype. It's called the Most Happy Medallion. Someone tried to recreate it here. This just gives you a clearer image of what they thought it would have looked like had it not been damaged. It was made as a prototype for coins, for metal. For metal, it was going to be struck. It was made in 1534 because at this time, Anne was pregnant, and the hope was that she was going to have a male heir, so they were going to distribute these medals, and of course she was going to be very happy about it because she was giving Henry his male heir. That didn't happen. The medals were never struck. Somewhere along the line, this medal obviously, or this prototype was obviously badly damaged, but in fact, that's really the only one that historians can authenticate and say, yeah, this was a contemporary image of Anne that we know for sure. Now, there were some computer technologists who in 2015, using facial recognition software, took this badly damaged disc, match it up with various paintings of Anne that were said to be Anne. And the closest could come was to this one called the Nin portrait. This one they think could actually be Anne, but they discounted some of the others, including the one that I had on the first slide there, because they said, no, the software doesn't match up. Another possible, but again, we don't know, image of Anne is in this very intriguing little ring. This ring is less than an inch. It's very tiny. It's called the Checkers Locket Ring. We believe it was a gift to Elizabeth I. It was not in her official inventory of her jewelry, but we think it was gifted to her. And the locket opens up, and on the bottom here, you can see Elizabeth I. And on the top, there's a woman dressed in the type of fashion of Henry VIII's court. So a lot of people kind of made the assumption that, well, perhaps someone gave this to Elizabeth as a gift, and this is her mother. This is Anne Boleyn. Elizabeth was also very close to her stepmother, Henry's final wife, Catherine Parr. They were quite close for a while. So it could have also been Catherine Parr. We don't know, but that's another puzzler. So another myth or question that often comes up is, did Anne bewitch Henry? Was she a sorceress? Did she break up his marriage? Well, of course she contributed. She most definitely contributed to the end of Henry's marriage. We know that. But by the time Anne caught Henry's eyes in the mid-1520s, his marriage was already faltering. He had stopped sleeping with the queen, with Catherine. They were pretty much living separate lives. And he was no longer expecting, obviously, an heir from her. In fact, a really strong sign of that was in 1525, I mentioned, that he had a mistress who had a son by him. And he decided in 1525 to recognize that son, not as a legitimate heir, but recognize him as his son. So the son got the title, the Duke of Richmond. He was Henry Fitzroy. Fitzroy means son of king. Making him the Duke of Richmond put him above everyone else in the court, any male heirs that Henry would have. He went to live in St. James's Palace. He was treated like a prince. And it was said that Catherine of Aragon wasn't too happy about that, because Henry and Catherine had this daughter, and she didn't like the fact that he was pushing, even though Henry Fitzroy was never legitimized as Henry's heir. But anyway, again, we don't know exactly when Henry started making advances toward Anne. What we do know is, unlike her sister Mary, Anne wasn't having any part of being a mistress of Henry's. She said, no, I'm not doing this. She made it very clear, I have no intentions of being your mistress. It's sometime, and again, we don't have exact dates, late 1526, maybe early 1527, Anne decides to leave court. She leaves the court, she returns to Hever Castle, and Henry starts bombarding her with a series of letters and gifts and jewels and other favors. And this is one of the letters that he wrote her. I'm not going to read it, but basically he said, I'm confused. You're sending me mixed messages. Do I have a chance with you? Do I not have a chance with you? And then he goes on to say, if you will just give your body and heart to me, I'll make you my only mistress. I won't have any other mistresses. You'll be my only mistress. But Anne's like, yeah, I don't think that's going to happen. But at some point, he wears her down, perhaps with a promise of marriage. So she comes back to court. She does not become his lover, but she says, okay, if you want to get married, I'll marry you. You have to marry me. I'm not going to be a lover. So she returns to court. She agrees to become his wife. In 1520, this is when the whole thing kicks off with the Catholic Church. Henry appeals to Pope Clement VII, and he says, I want an annulment from my marriage to Catherine of Aragon. And the reason he said, I broke biblical law because I slept with my brother's wife. Henry conveniently forgot he'd already gotten a dispensation to marry Catherine of Aragon, but whatever. So the Pope, of course, wasn't ready and willing to give him an annulment. And to kind of confuse matters even more, or to make it a little more interesting, Catherine was not necessarily going to go quietly. So she went to the Pope and said, hey, look, my marriage was never consummated with Arthur, despite the fact that the day after their marriage, Arthur got up and boasted to his court about how he, had slept with Catherine and he was a man. But he was a 15-year-old, so that could have been boasting as well. Catherine of Aragon was very pious, not likely to lie about things. But she said, I swear I was a virgin when I married Henry. So what this meant was a long, protracted court battle that went on forever between Catherine and Henry and the Vatican. Cardinal Wolsey, whose name I mentioned earlier, he was Henry, and he was put in charge of making sure Henry got this annulment. That didn't happen. He failed on that count. That led to his humiliation and downfall. And meanwhile, Anne and Henry are getting more and more frustrated, and Anne's continuing to fend off Henry's sexual advances. So Henry decides to take another route with some of his advisors, and he finds some old Anglo-Saxon documents going way back to the 600s that say, by law, the king has spiritual supremacy over the church. So Henry's like, okay, I can now get around the Vatican. I'm the head of the church. I don't have to go to the Vatican. So in 1532, Parliament actually, first the English church, and I'm kind of surprised about this, but they agreed. They said, okay, we will give up any independence as well as authority. It's all to you. It's all to you. And that led the following year to some legislation that said, all right, English can no longer go to Rome to appeal on behalf of matters of matrimony and a few others. So this puts Henry in a good position now, because Henry said, I don't need your permission. I can do whatever I want. So we know that sometime between late 1532 and 33, Henry and Anne were married in a secret ceremony. At this time, Catherine of Aragon and her daughter Mary had already been sent away from court. Anne Boleyn was living at court. She was living in Catherine of Aragon's sumptuous apartments. She was wearing Catherine of Aragon's jewels even before she married Henry, but they got married. And if we believe the latter date of early 1533, when they got married, then Anne was already in the early stages of pregnancy at that time. Henry's Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cranmer, declared Henry's marriage to Catherine invalid, and Anne becomes Henry's new queen. Now, not surprisingly, this was not popular. This was not popular. Catherine of Aragon and her daughter were both very popular figures with the people and at the court. And there was a lot of loyalty to them. And Anne was seen as this upstart and hanging around for years. Her haughty personality, she was pretty conceited, so she didn't make a lot of friends. And she was also known to speak very cruelly about Catherine and Mary. I think she still saw them as a threat. I think she was kind of, she was worried about them, still kind of hanging around in the background. So the marriage wasn't popular, but Henry really wanted to send a message about this. So a few months after they married, he put on this lavish 4-day coronation ceremony for Anne. He stayed a couple of nights for the coronation at the Tower of London in very redone apartments he just had refurbished. This was common when monarchs were crowned. They usually stayed at the Tower of London before their coronation. And they had this huge procession, hundreds and hundreds of bishops and other clergy and noblemen and ladies in waitings from the Tower of London to Westminster. And on almost every street corner, there was a pageant or an ornamental arch or music playing. And that's what you see on the right here. This was a sketch, again, by Hans Holbein. Yep. Somebody have a question? Okay. And that's what you see on the right here is the sketch by Hans Holbein of one of the arches, the celebratory arches for her coronation. The very interesting thing about Anne's coronation is when she was crowned queen, she was crowned with the crown of Edward. That crown had never been used except by a monarch, not the monarch's wife, only the monarch. So Henry was sending a very, very strong message here about Anne and her place. So by the time of the coronation, Anne was heavily pregnant, and everyone thought it was going to be a boy, including astrologers who back in the day people really believed in and counted on and were never wrong. They all said it was going to be a boy, to such an extent that Henry was so sure of this, he actually had the birth announcement made up ahead of time before the birth. But however, on September 7th, 1533, Anne gave birth to, as someone else said, her only living child, a daughter who was named Elizabeth. And it's hard to read this, especially if you don't know how to read this script from this time period. But basically, this is the word prince. And they had to shove in 2 S's here to make it princess, because they think that. So that was a little bit of editing at the last minute. So over the next 2.5 years, Anne suffered at least 1 miscarriage and 1 possible stillbirth that we know of. We do know from contemporary accounts of the time that in the summer of 1534, she was again heavily pregnant. Henry and Anne were supposed to go to France. That trip was canceled because she was so far along in her pregnancy. That's when that most happy medal was supposed to be minted. But by the fall, Anne was no longer pregnant. There's no record of what happened. We don't know if she had a late-term miscarriage, if she had a stillbirth. Rumor has it was a male fetus. But again, that's rumor. We have no way of knowing. Okay, another, not myth necessarily, but another question mark. These are really more question marks than myths, some of them, except maybe the sixth thing. Did Anne cause the death of innocent men? Because Henry's marriage was so unpopular, and it was not recognized by the Vatican, and he was actually excommunicated by the Catholic Church, his parliament passed some legislation. The first one was that Act in Restraint of Appeals. That was the one I mentioned earlier, where you could no longer go to Rome to appeal matters of matrimony. And then he passed the Act of Supremacy. And what this said was basically he had supremacy. This really created the Church of England, what we call the Anglican Church. Over here, we call the Episcopalian Church. This really cemented that break with Rome. And it said, okay, we're severed. Church of England is supreme in this country. In fact, if you support the Pope or Catholicism over the Church of England, that's treasonable for that. And then to carry it even further, because of Anne's pregnancy, came the oath of succession. And this was an oath everyone had to sign. And basically it said that it recognized the legitimacy of Henry's marriage to Anne, and also the legitimacy of any children that they would have. And this became a step too far for some people. Many prominent clergy and some counselors, most famously Sir Thomas More here on the right-hand side. He was Henry's Lord Chancellor after Cardinal Wolsey was put aside for not being able to get that annulment through. And he was a very strong Catholic. They refused to sign the oath, and they were put to death. They were executed. And of course, this, again, historically all came down on Anne's shoulders. It was Anne's fault. Anne talked Henry into doing this. I don't think so. I mean, definitely, I'm sure Anne had a staked interest in making sure that these oaths were signed and that the Act of Supremacy went through. She wanted her children to be legitimate. She wanted to be in a legitimate marriage. But Henry, Henry knew what he was doing. But again, she became the responsible person for this. Okay, this is a funny photo. I'm not saying Elizabeth Taylor was a nagging wife. I'll tell you in a minute why I put this up. Another question was, well, did Anne, nag Henry to the point where she's such a pain that, he just had to get rid of her? They had a very volatile relationship, Henry and Anne did. We know this. And that's why I put Liz and Dick up here, because it kind of reminds me of Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton. By the time Anne and Henry had wed, they'd already been together at least 5 years, if not longer, while this whole protracted battle went on with the Vatican. And Anne was very headstrong. She was very outspoken. She was not the quiet little lady. And the very thing that kind of appealed to Henry about Anne when they were courting, he didn't like so much when she became queen. He kind of wanted her to do the queenly thing and sit back and be pregnant and let him have his mistresses and, not cause a fuss. That just wasn't Anne. Henry should have known that. That was not Anne. So she had a very sharp temper, as did he. She was very outspoken. She was not afraid to speak up. So they would have these enormous fights where everyone at court thought for sure that was it. It was over. They were done with. And then they would have passionate makeups. So a little bit like Liz and Dick here, I think. So their fights and their reconciliations were very frequent. So what ultimately led to Anne's downfall? Again, there's a lot of speculation about this. Historians still argue about this. Was it the fact that she didn't give Henry a male heir? Was it, that last miscarriage that she had that I'll talk about in a minute? Was Henry getting tired of her? He had already started, by the year that her downfall started, he was already looking elsewhere. He had an interest in Jane Seymour, which we'll talk about later. Was it a falling out with her enemies at court, including Thomas Cromwell? And that's another huge question mark, Thomas Cromwell's role in all of this. We don't know for sure, but there are certain signs and indicators, and I think it was probably a combination of several things. What we do know is that she was married a little more than 3 years, the winter and spring of 1536, she started seeing trouble. Things started going wrong for Anne. So, first of all, before we get to Tom, that's okay, we'll just keep him up here. In early January of 1536, Catherine of Aragon died. Anne was pregnant again. So this should have been great for her, right? Finally, Catherine is no longer this shadow hanging over her. Her marriage cannot be disputed as being legitimate now because Henry has no other living wife. She's pregnant again, so that all sounds great. But on the 24th of January, Henry suffered a really devastating accident while he was jousting. His horse fell over on top of him, kind of crushing him. He was knocked unconscious for more than 2 hours. Everyone thought he was dead. Of course, Anne was, highly hysterical about this because Henry was her protection. He was the only reason she was at court, basically. And a few days later, Anne suffered her final miscarriage, which was devastating for both of them. It was said she was about 14 weeks pregnant. Again, the rumor was it was a male fetus. Or without ultrasound, how much you can tell at that point, maybe, I don't know. But in any event, we know that Henry was devastated. He was furious, not trending in the right direction. So Thomas Cromwell, where does Thomas Cromwell come into this? Thomas Cromwell was in the service of the man on the right, Cardinal Wolsey, who I mentioned earlier, and he was quite loyal to Cardinal Wolsey. When Cardinal Wolsey could not get this annulment in place for Henry, his downfall was pretty swift. And there's, again, a lot of reasons why Cromwell or why Wolsey's downfall, things that contributed to it, but certainly that was one of the big ones. So Cromwell kind of steps in. Now, Wolsey already had a little bit of a history with Anne too, because in 1532, when Anne first came to court, about a year after she came to court, she fell in love with a young nobleman named Henry Percy, and he was in the employ of Cardinal Wolsey. And it was thought that Anne wasn't good enough for Henry Percy. She was a nobleman's daughter, but her father, Thomas Boleyn, wasn't that high up the pecking chain as Percy was. So Wolsey broke up the relationship. Anne was sent back to Hever for a while. She was kind of banished back to Hever for a while. And some say that Anne never got over that she kind of held a grudge against Wolsey. In any event, Cromwell comes into court, and in some ways, Cromwell and Anne were the sources of each other's power, because Cromwell was a very astute, kind of self-made man. He came from a humble sort of background. He was not a noble. But he knew that Henry really wanted to divorce Anne. Divorce Catherine and marry Anne. He saw what happened to his boss, Wolsey. So Cromwell said, I can make this happen. And he did. He basically paved the way for Anne to become queen. So they kind of owed their power in a sense to each other. She recognized his abilities. He worked for Henry, but he also worked for Anne. He was her chief steward. He was getting 20 pounds a year for being her chief. But their alliance was really one of convenience. They were both religious reformists. They both believed in the new religion. They had that in common. But although Anne recognized Cromwell's usefulness, there was no real affection there, and she got what she wanted. She was now queen. And so he was just as far as she was concerned. Likewise, Cromwell, he didn't feel any personal loyalty or affection, and all of his focus was on whatever Henry wanted, he was going to make happen. So if Henry wanted to keep Anne happy, Cromwell would try to keep Anne happy, but basically he was in the service of Henry. And at some point they had a breakdown. Their relationship broke down. One theory was that with the split with Rome, the monasteries in England were all dissolved. The money, the lands, all went back to Henry, to the king, and he parceled out favors to people, and he sold some of the lands to people. Cromwell was in charge of all of that, of making sure these monasteries got dissolved. And it was said that, and people lined their pockets. Henry lined his pocket. Cromwell lined his pockets to a certain extent with the sale of these monasteries. And one of the theories was there's some evidence that Anne was unhappy about this. She thought the money should have gone to more charitable purposes. So even though she was kind of this very problematic woman, nothing's black and white. She was also very charitable. We know that from her household records, that she often gave money to people in need. And she was religious herself in the reformist religion. So we see this downfall, this breakdown kind of start happening between Cromwell and Anne. And at one point, Eustace Chapuis, the man I mentioned earlier, the ambassador to the Holy Roman Emperor, he reported on a fight, a very public argument that Cromwell and Anne had, during which time she basically said she'd like to see Cromwell's head off his shoulders. Now, we know Anne had a bad temper and would spout off left and right. Whether she could have affected that, we don't know. But Chapuis also tells us that it was Cromwell who really orchestrated Anne's downfall. And he said that Cromwell boasted to him about this and said, I'm the one that made this happen. I planned and brought about the whole affair. Again, is this idle boasting? Does he mean that I brought it about because the king wanted me to bring it about? We don't have any absolute proof, but we do know that of all of Anne's enemies at court, Cromwell probably had the greatest incentive to get rid of her. We know that already, at this point, Henry was pretty tired of her. And whether he instructed Cromwell to get him out of the marriage, like he did with Catherine of Aragon, and when he asked him to do so, we have no idea. He had turned elsewhere to Jane Seymour, who was a lady in waiting to Anne Boleyn. And so Cromwell was poised to take action. He really wanted to get Anne out of there. But what Chapuis tells us he thinks was the real driving force between with Cromwell saying, I've really got to get rid of this woman once and for all and really get rid of her, was a discussion he had with the king in April of 1536. Cromwell had been working very closely with Chapuis to try to effect an alliance between the Holy Roman Empire and England. There was this triangulation between the Holy Roman Empire, France, and England. They were either fighting with each other, liking each other, ganging up on each other. Anne wanted an alliance with France, and she was pushing for an alliance with France. There was some talk about getting the baby Elizabeth betrothed to the Dauphin, the future king of France. So Anne was pushing for that. When Cromwell approached Henry about this alliance with the Holy Roman Empire, Henry blew up. He exploded. He publicly berated Cromwell in the most humiliating fashion. And to Cromwell, that was a sign that Henry's still in Anne's grips, despite this latest miscarriage, despite the fact that Henry seems to be turning his attention elsewhere and he's sick of her and they're fighting. He has seen them fight 100 times and come back together. So he saw Anne as a really dangerous enemy, not only to his future at court, but to possibly his life as well. It was kind of, there was this, it's going to be her or it's going to be me. So the first thing he did was he aligned himself very closely with Jane Seymour's brothers who were at court. And they had been looking around for some time to figure out how to oust Anne and get their sister on the throne, because that would give them political clout. Cromwell was a very, very smart, astute, accomplished lawyer. So he knew whatever he did, it had to be an ironclad case to break this marriage off. And it wasn't enough to divorce somebody simply because they didn't give you a son. That wasn't enough. He also couldn't do the religious justification again. They tried that with Catherine. That was not going to work this time. So he said, his thinking was, we think, the only thing he could do is make Anne a traitor. Prove that Anne was a traitor, punishable by death. He never had to worry about these people again. And Anne played into this because she was very flirtatious. She played the game of courtly love. It's something she learned at the French court. She enjoyed it. She loved surrounding herself with male admirers. And this behavior
Anne, we're not hearing you right now.
was doing. He said he was ill. This was right when we attacked him. But we do know that when he came back, he immediately asked to meet with Henry. We don't know what went on in that meeting, but the belief is that he shared his, he was either collecting evidence at this time by talking to Anne's ladies in waiting and putting spies in the court. So he may have already been starting some secret investigations, but he went to Henry and he said, I've got evidence that Anne has been cheating on you and also behaving in a treasonous manner. So Henry said, okay, I need to see all the evidence, gather all the evidence. And from there on in, this happened the last week in April of 1536, everything went very, very, very fast. So on April 30th, Cromwell arrested a young musician in Anne's household named Mark Smeaton. And he didn't arrest him. He actually invited him to his home, to Cromwell's home. He invited Mark Smeaton to come to his home. Nobody, Henry really didn't know until he had this meeting with Cromwell. So Cromwell invites Mark Smeaton to his home. He ends up holding him there for 24 hours and badgering him until he gets a confession out of him that, yes, I slept with a queen. And then Cromwell went on to say, okay, what about this man and this man and this man who was in the queen's household that I've heard things about? What about them? And Smeaton ends up giving him some additional names, including Anne's own brother. Some supposition that Smeaton was tortured for this information, but that was never proven. So we don't know. But all we know is that's all it took. The minute Cromwell had that information, he went with it, he ran with it, and everything followed very, very, very quickly. So the following day, Smeaton is in the Tower of London. Anne and Henry go to the May Day celebrations at Greenwich. It's a traditional thing every year with jousts. And Henry seemed to be very happy, people said. Halfway through the celebrations, someone came up, handed Henry a note. He got up and he grabbed Henry Norris to go along with him. Henry Norris held a very high position in Henry VIII's court, and he was also a very close friend of Henry's, also one of that group of people that Anne surrounded herself with. So Henry drags Henry Norris back to London with him, and on the way there, he accuses him of adultery with Anne. And Henry Norris is shocked and said, I don't know what you're talking about. I had nothing to do with Anne. I've never touched Anne. But nonetheless, and Henry VIII says, look, I'll give you a pardon. You're my good friend. Just admit to it. I'll give you a pardon. But Henry Norris said, no, I didn't do anything wrong. Henry Norris ends up getting arrested and thrown in the Tower of London. The very next day, Anne and her brother George are arrested and escorted to the Tower of London in the company, it is said, of Thomas Cromwell. And then very quickly after that, 2 days later, William Brereton, these are all men who were at Henry's court and had high positions at Henry's court. So William Brereton was arrested. And then the following day, Francis Weston was arrested. Francis Weston was another one of Anne's circle of friends and admirers. And Cromwell started blocking access to the king, to Anne, and to any of her supporters. So there was no way to kind of appeal to him or even say, what the heck's going on? You know, what's happening here? So we have all of these arrests coming in. We know that there were 2 other arrests, but they were close associates of Cromwell's, and they were released almost immediately. Brereton's an interesting one, and this raised eyebrows when he was arrested because he was almost 50 years old at the time of his arrest. He was not in Anne's close circle of friends or admirers, but he dominated monasteries in Cheshire where he lived. And he was able to successfully block Cromwell's attempts at reform in that area. So he was a thorn in Cromwell's side. And in fact, most of the men who were arrested and implicated with Anne were opponents of Cromwell in one way or another. So whether Cromwell himself came up with the scheme of, I'm going to kill the queen, we don't know. I mean, obviously Henry was involved in this, but certainly it looks like Cromwell did take advantage of this situation to get some of his enemies while he was there. So was Anne innocent or was she guilty? While she was in the Tower, we know she vacillated between calmness and hysteria. She laughed, she cried, she joked. 1 minute she thought that Henry was going to let her go, that he was just testing her. Another minute she thought she'd go the way of Catherine of Aragon. You know, she'd be banished from court, maybe sent to a nunnery. The next minute she was resigned to the fact that she was going to lose her life based on these charges against her. We know this because Cromwell put ladies in the Tower with her to write down everything she said, to basically spy on her. And he told the constable of the Tower, I want to know everything she says. I want to know any correspondence she gets, because I think Cromwell was really looking for some more hard evidence. Anne had denied all this. Everyone accused with Anne, with the exception of Mark Smeaton, denied the charges right up until their death. So he was trying to, get more evidence. So at the trial, this is interesting. With the exception of Anne's brother, the other men accused of adultery with Anne were tried by a jury that was made up of people who either owed Henry and or Cromwell money or favors. Also, one member of Jane Seymour's family. So not exactly the most unbiased jury. Also, the charges against, particularly these incest charges with her brother, were secondhand. They were accused of incest. They came from two secondhand sources, one from a lady in waiting to Anne, and one from Anne's sister-in-law, her brother's wife. But in both cases, neither woman wrote anything down. Neither woman, they gave their reports to other people. So the lady in waiting, who was the Countess of Worcester, her name was Elizabeth Somerset, her brother came forward and said, Elizabeth told me that the Queen has slept with her brother, or she's had unnatural relationships with her brother. But Elizabeth Somerset's brother was a staunch Catholic who was a big supporter of Princess Mary, who was Catherine of Aragon's daughter. So he had, reason not to like Anne. The other report coming from George Boleyn's wife, Jane Rochford, that came via Thomas Cromwell. Again, neither lady, we have no evidence that they were ever questioned by the court. They were ever questioned by the judges or the councils. In fact, almost all of the testimony that condemned Anne and George Boleyn to death was verbal, not written down. We do know that there were also a couple of other incidences that really played against Anne and probably led to some of these arrests. One incident involved an ill-advised argument, I guess you could say, with Henry Norris, that good friend of Henry VIII, that was arrested early on. One day they were said to have had an argument at court, and this was seen by her ladies in waitings and other, where Anne basically accused Henry Norris of looking for dead man's shoes. She said, "You want to step into dead man's shoes," and what she was accusing him of was, when the king dies, you're going to want to marry me. You think you want to marry me. And again, Henry Norris strongly denied this and said, "I'd rather lose my head," which ironically he did. But, so they were having an argument. Who knows how this came about, but you can't talk about the monarch's death. That's treasonous. And then the second one was Francis Weston, another court person who was arrested. And that was said that was more of this kind of courtly love, stupid, fatal flirting thing, where at one point, Anne was teasing Weston about something, about a girl she thought that Weston was going after. And he said, no, I only love you. So these incidences were taken, they were twisted in such a way or manipulated in such a way that they could point toward some of this guilt. But the really damning thing was the dubious dates. This really kind of puts it almost exclusively, we can be sure that Anne was innocent of these charges, because there were no witnesses, number one, to any of these sexual encounters. And as I said, everyone involved except Mark Smeaton said they were innocent to the end. And back then, people were very religious. And when you made your last confession, if you thought you were lying in that confession, you really believed you were going to hell. So they all confessed that they were not guilty. But the dates are what's really interesting here. If you look at the indictments and you look at the court records, and I've looked at some of these, and historians have delved into these much more than I have, but I did look at some of them. The dates, they have very, very specific dates. On this date, this year she slept with this guy. On this date, on this year she slept with this guy. At least two of the dates given in those records were dates when Anne had either just very recently given birth or just very recently had a miscarriage. Not the time you feel like having a sexual liaison with someone. And Anne's seminal biographer, a guy named Eric Ives, he really did a deep dive. He discounted 3/4 of the dates in there, in part because of what I was just saying, but also because he said most of these dates, we've got the court records, she wasn't even at the same palace or court or part of London that the person she supposedly was sleeping with was at. And finally, you're surrounded, the king and his consort were surrounded constantly 24 hours a day by servants, even at night. So could Anne have snuck something on the side with one man if she had a very faithful servant who was willing to lie for her and sneak her out in the middle of the night? Yeah, it's possible. She wasn't always sleeping with the king either, so they could have been in two different places. But the idea of her being able to carry on with 5 different men over almost the entire course of her marriage seems very highly unlikely. So Anne refuted all the charges. She was very calm about it, but in truth, her fate was already sealed. Henry had already hired an executioner from France before the trial even started, and the jury knew what it had to do. So it was pretty much a foregone conclusion. Anne and her brother were sentenced to death. All the other men were sentenced to death. And then 2 days before her execution, and she said this at her trial, actually. She said, look, I've never sinned against him in any other way other than, yes, I've had jealousy about him. I've had suspicions about him, meaning she was jealous of his looking at other women. It may have not been humble. She definitely wasn't a humble person. But she said, in no other way have I, sinned against the king. She was very clear about that. And at the execution, and this is a very interesting woodcut from the 1600s, a German woodcut from the 1600s, 2 days before her death, her marriage was declared null and void. Her only daughter, her only child, living child, Elizabeth, was deemed a bastard. So she was no longer the Princess Elizabeth. She was the Lady Elizabeth. Anne was executed at the Tower of London on May 19th, 1536, with a sword, not an axe. That was the one supposed act of kindness that the king was giving her. And she was executed just around 3 years after that glorious coronation that she had. Thomas Cromwell was in attendance, but even her critics conceded that she handled herself with great dignity and courage at the very end. After her death, her body was put into a case made to hold arrows because they hadn't even gotten a coffin for her. And she was carried a very short distance to this chapel in the grounds of the Tower of London. She was buried in front of the altar alongside her brother, who was executed 2 days before that. The next day, Henry rode off, got himself engaged to Jane Seymour. 2 weeks later, he married Jane Seymour. Cromwell aligned himself more with Seymour's family by arranging the marriage of his son to Jane Seymour's sister, so thereby giving him a closer kinship to the King of England himself. Jane ultimately gave Henry the son he wanted, but she died 12 days after her son's birth. Now, after Anne's execution in 1536, her father left the court. He withdrew from court for a while. As I said, he was also prominent in Henry's court, but only for a short while. He did come back in favor. It didn't actually ruin his court career, but both of her parents died within a few years of her. And interestingly enough, spoiler alert, if you don't already know this, Thomas Cromwell and George Boleyn's wife, Jane Rochford, who supposedly gave one of the accounts of this incest, were both executed by Henry, different dates, but similar charges. Henry did have that son. He did succeed Henry when Henry died. His name was Edward VI, but he died when he was only 15 years old. He was a boy king. He became king at 9, died at 15. And he was followed by Catherine of Aragon's daughter, Mary. And then after Mary died, by Elizabeth, Anne Boleyn's daughter. So basically, Anne's story really leaves us with more questions. Oh, and this is a plaque, a Victorian era plaque. Anne Boleyn's body is said to be buried beneath in the flooring beneath. So the question, it leaves us with more questions than answers even today. But we know that what she's best known for is her notoriety. That follows her everywhere. I think that's a little unfair. She was highly intelligent. She was a patron of the arts. She was a champion of religious reformation. She was very charitable, but she was outspoken. She was haughty. She had a very quick temper. She could be very cruel. She said and did some very cruel things. And I think she was very, very insecure because for most of the time she was with Henry, she still had that stain against her reputation. And she also had Catherine was still over her shoulder for most of the time that she was with Henry, and then later his daughter. But her lasting legacy, and I kind of almost hate to say it this way because I don't like to think of queens as just breeding animals, but her lasting legacy really is that she gave England one of the greatest monarchs in British history, the daughter that Henry did not want, Elizabeth I. And I would have loved to have had Henry come back from the dead and see how that one worked out, because she was her father's daughter in every conceivable way. All right, I did go over. I'm sorry. I knew this was going to be a problem, but I'd want to end by I love this. Someone put this on Twitter last year. This is the 6 wives of Henry VIII if they had never met him. And they're all kind of laughing and happy. So thank you very much. I'm going to end my presentation there and get out of here and stop sharing. And I know I went over the time. I'm sorry. I knew that was going to happen. I cut and cut and cut and cut and cut, and I still had too much. So please ask questions if you want elaboration on anything. I really kind of had to hop through a lot of that quickly. So please feel free to ask questions. Dispute what I said. Everybody has their interpretation. And, you know, like I said, historians are still arguing to this day over all of this. So thoughts, questions? Yes. Oops, you're muted. Your microphone is muted.
Okay, not
There
about Anne, but
okay.
the headgear.
Yes.
Are there any surviving examples of the frames, you know?
There was something called the French hood and the gable hood.
Right,
So the gable hood is that one that Anne brought the French hood with her into the English court. That's a really good question.
But, you know, is it bone? Yeah, I mean, what's the rigid thing? I'm wondering. Do we know that?
I don't know that, but you know, it's interesting you asked this because I signed up for a lecture at the Wallace Gallery in London that is talking about fashion from the Tudors onward. So I'll get that answer to you. I'll make sure. Yeah, because that's coming up. And I don't know that any of them still exist, but I'm sure someone knows how they were made. And I don't know if it was bone, especially the gable one. I mean, the French one is, you know, a little bonnet thing, but the gable one is pretty structural. Yeah, that's a good question.
Very.
Yeah, I don't know if there are any survive. I know there's a piece of Elizabeth I's dress that still survives. It was at Hampton Court on display, just a piece of fabric. Wow. A few years ago, but yeah, I don't know if the headdress, if the headgears, I'll find out and I will let you know, especially after I go to that lecture. I'll make a note of that and make sure that Cheryl can share that information. Other comments or yes?
Oh, am I mute or am I?
Oh, you're good. I can hear you.
Okay. So what do you think of the theory of that that Anne was rhesus negative and as a result that she'd reject all rhesus positive babies and that, you know, and that causes one live birth and then multiple miscarriages after that?
It's kind of interesting what they're talking about now in reference to that in genetics and that kind of thing. The more contemporary theory right now is that Henry was the one who had problems. Because multiple miscarriages. Henry did father a son with Elizabeth Blount, who was the one mistress who gave him a son. And then of course he had a son with Jane Seymour. By the time he got to wife number 4, he didn't even sleep with wife number 4. That's another whole, I mean, he rejected her within 6 months of marrying her. And certainly he was getting up there in age by that time. He was having health problems. There were no more pregnancies. So the bulk of pregnancies we saw were with Anne and with Catherine. There was a rumor that Anne's sister Mary, that one of her 2 children, if not both of them, were Henry's. But again, that's rumor and we don't know. But from what geneticists are saying, that really now it's determined by the man. I mean, it's determined by both who the sex of the child is. But there's some theory, and I'm not a scientist, that it was really maybe more of Henry's problem than his wife's problems. Again, Anne was pregnant 3 times in 3 years. We know that for sure. We don't know if those other 2 were male or female fetuses. We do know that at least on one, and Anne, again, you've got to remember, if you look at the dates of Anne's birth, because we don't know, there's that supposition, if indeed she was born in 1501, and there is some good evidence that she probably was, she would have been 35 by the time she was in her 3rd pregnancy. That's really quite old by the standards of the day. Even now, that's still considered, I think they call it geriatric pregnancy, which is really insulting to women who are 35 today. But back then, that was already kind of getting up there. So, and she had that shock of Henry's accident and thought he was dead. you know, so, and just I would imagine just the anxiety of knowing that every time you're pregnant, you've got to have a son, you know, this one better be a son. So there could be lots of reasons that played into these miscarriages. But we also know, as I said, that Catherine of Aragon also suffered, and as did actually, well, we're not sure about Henry's daughter, Mary. It was said that she might have had a couple of false pregnancies. We're not sure. But certainly the Tudors did not have a good record for having children. You know, I mean, this is why the dynasty didn't. And then you get Elizabeth, who was the famous virgin queen, who never got married, you know. So
there's no, has there been any attempt to get DNA samples?
Not that I am aware of, no. Not that I've heard of. As I said, I did read a few years ago something in the literature, and again, my brain is as far from science as it could possibly be. So I didn't really understand all of it, but whatever it was, they were explaining this and that, and they thought, yeah, it could actually have been, ironically, all of this could have been down to Henry's genetic makeup, not these women. But I can't, it was quite a while ago that I read it, but I know that
because there's several things in, you know, in museums and things that we know they touched. I mean,
yeah, I know. And you know, it's interesting because they did it recently with Richard III.
I was going to say, Richard, you have to be buried in a parking lot to have DNA done.
yeah, but yeah, I guess so. But no, I've not heard anything that they've tried to do in that manner with Henry's buried at Windsor Castle. And if you've ever, not at the castle, but it's it's St. George's Chapel, which is in the Windsor Castle grounds, and with his third wife, with Jane Seymour. And you walk in there and you don't even realize you're walking right over the top of them. I mean, they're buried right underneath the altar, the two of them. So I don't know. Certainly they could go down there and dig them up, I guess, and get some DNA if they wanted to. But yeah, for whatever reason, I guess there's been no will to do so to date. But yeah. Other comments or questions?
I mean, there we go. Well, I thought this was really excellent. You know, I am, you know, an Anne Boleyn aficionado, and you really put it together in really a very nice timeline. And my daughter was tuned in. She
good.
So.
Well, thank you. It was like I said, toward the end when I first wrote it, it was really long, and I kept slashing and slashing. I'm like, oh, this is turning into a Wikipedia entry. So I was trying to keep it informative enough.
Oh yes, and
keep
you know,
moving along.
I'm sure if any of you have tuned in, you must have enough interest to probably know that there's the PBS series on, and it's a 3-parter, and it just started 2 weeks ago. And the third, is it only 3?
I think it's only 3. It's 3. It's called The Boleyns, A Scandalous Family.
And you know, they try to make, you know, a scandalous family, but it's really well done. It's more of a documentary than one of these silly dramas, you know, bodice rippers. It's not that at all.
Right. Yeah.
It's got very, you know, it's got all of the English professors who all look like they're from the Monty Python.
It is just amazing. Yeah, it's amazing to watch them all. Yeah, and they all, I mean, not on that particular, I haven't seen that one. I know it's on, and I know it was on, and I think I saw the first episode. Actually, it was free on YouTube when it was on in England, but I haven't seen it here yet. Yeah. But it is interesting to see all the different theories and see how they still, like, there's one guy, and he's actually, I don't like him. His personality is, I forget which university he's at, but he's pushing the theory that Anne was guilty.
I just started reading that book.
Did you read it? And you know,
yeah, I'm in the middle of it.
So he attacks, he goes after other historians. You know, like, people will write academic articles and then somebody will write a refutation, you know, they'll write a comment to the article. But he gets particularly kind of nasty when he writes back, you know, when he publishes these things. But the thing, and I said, I'm going to sound like a total snob, and I don't mean to, but I guess I am. First of all, I didn't like him because I knew he was attacking other people in a way that I thought, you know, you can.
That's how you get published.
You can refute. Well, no, he would do this like in scholarly journals, though. This is my, you know, answer to this. And it was fine. Of course, people disagree and they argue, and that's fine, you know, but keep it respectful. But I said, this is really snobby of me. When I saw his book come out, the title is Anne Boleyn, Fatal Attractions. And I went, oh, no. No, I'm sorry. You know, I mean, God, you call yourself a serious scholar, and this is what you've named your book. But as you said, in order to get published, you have to have a new theory. It's like writing your dissertation. You can't just compete with
And a sexy title helps.
And the sexy title helps. But I just went, oh, I don't like that title. I don't think I personally would have liked Anne if I met her. I think she had a very strong personality. I don't think she was a woman's woman. I think she was a man's woman. But I admire her. You know, I mean, she was strong. She was outspoken. I really admire that about her. She was pretty nasty to Catherine and Mary in a way that I think that was driven by her own anxieties and her own insecurities. So I'll cut her some slack that way. I think.
So when you say she was nasty, where's the evidence of that?
Oh, there's written, well, again, some of this comes from Chapuis, so we do have to take some of it with a grain of salt. Chapuis, after saying that, you know, he's biased, and he was biased, of course, but at the same time, even Chapuis said when she was put to death, that he said publicly she was innocent. This is nonsense. You know, so I do have to also kind of temper my own, you know, and say, okay, he tried to be. But supposedly she said things like, you know, I am going to, you know, bring down that Spanish blood. And we know that she, you know, when Elizabeth was born, when her daughter was born, she went to Henry and said, I want Mary to serve Elizabeth. I want Mary in Elizabeth's household. Mary is a bastard. She serves Elizabeth. You know, so, and again, I'm not putting on Anne because it was Henry's wife and daughter. You know, he's ultimately the one who decided how he was going to treat them. And I always had a soft spot, even though she's got a really horrendous history. Mary, who became Bloody Mary and did indeed kill a lot of Protestants. But then Henry killed a lot of people too, and he was never called Bloody Henry. So it's the male-female thing again. But I felt sorry for Mary because when Catherine and Mary were banished from court, they were separated. Mary never got to see her mother again. Her mother, when she was dying, she did not get to see her mother. And I thought that was a particular piece of cruelty that was totally unnecessary. Mary was a strong young girl. She was also, and both Catherine and Mary, neither one of them rolled over easily.
Nor did, you know, Elizabeth was dragged around all,
no, they were all, I mean, they were all, and so I always kind of felt sorry for Mary because I thought she never even got to say goodbye to her mother when she was dying. She didn't get to be with her mother. She was threatened by Thomas Howard, who was an uncle of Anne Boleyn's. I didn't even get into this, but you know, he went to Mary's household when Mary wouldn't sign the oath of succession or recognize the marriage, and said, if you were my daughter, I would bash your head against the wall until it was as soft as a baked apple.
Yeah.
You know, and that was documented. Like, what a horrible thing to say to a young woman, you know. So, and she had some psychological problems. You know, she had an unhappy marriage when she did marry. She married Philip of Spain, who was much younger than her. He kind of disappeared. 5 minutes after he married her, he went back to Spain. She had these possible phantom pregnancies. She was only queen for 5 years. And she did horrible things, as they all did. But I kind of felt sorry for her because I felt like she was probably very badly, well, they were all badly in some ways. I think they were all psychologically damaged, including Elizabeth. There's really good reasons why Elizabeth never got married. And there's a ton of theories about that as well. But certainly knowing that your mother was beheaded, seeing your stepmother beheaded, you know, there were other things that went on that I won't go into here that possibly, and Elizabeth just wasn't going to have a man, you know, she was going to rule in her own right. And she saw how, you know, how other marriages had worked out. So yeah. Very interesting, very, very interesting, but yeah. So I do honor Anne and I do respect Anne. I don't think I would have been a friend, but that's another story. Other questions or comments?
Deb, if you haven't watched the PBS thing yet, the guy who wrote the Owen.
Owen Emerson. I hope you get to meet him when
he's featured. He's featured. Have you met him?
Yes, once.
Oh, so if I meet him, I'll say
he's a very nice man. Very, very, very nice.
Well,
man.
I just
very
hope
enthusiastic and very.
I just hope Hever is, you know, not closed because of.
I don't think Hever will be closed. I think what you're going, if you see anything, and again, I could be wrong because when's the last time we had a huge funeral? I mean, Diana's funeral was on a Saturday. I don't honestly remember if anything was closed, but often for these, this is going to be bigger than Diana's funeral. I mean, this is really going to be a state funeral. So my guess is on the day of the funeral, things will be closed. Everything will be shut down. It just depends what day that's going to be. I'm guessing it takes a few days to get all these things in order, even though they've got the plans in place. It's called London Bridge is